Hi there, and thanks so much for joining me for My Week. I'm Christy McDonald. So many times I've opened the show and said another historic week for Detroit, and here we go again. What happened in Lansing with the grand bargain is a historic milestone for the bankruptcy process. We have never seen anything like this, and it involves everyone in the state. This is not a Detroit story. This is a Michigan story. Retirees live in every county, and the viability of our biggest city will impact all of us. So tonight, the grand bargain, what it took to make the deal, the oversight, foundations, and where we go from here. Plus, the latest on the new international trade crossing, and can Lansing get an agreement on fixing our roads? But we start with the grand bargain, and let's take a look at the deal. Close to $195 million will go to Detroit to aid in the bankruptcy process. That includes offsetting cuts to pensions and protecting art at the DIA from being sold to satisfy creditors. This is added to $370 million from foundations and $100 million from the DIA. Conditions come with this money, though, a 9-member oversight commission that will have authority over Detroit's finances for the next 13 years. The governor is signing the bill this week. And this is where we start tonight with Nolan Finley from the Detroit News and Stephen Henderson from the Detroit Free Press. Gentlemen, we've been talking about, can this deal actually get done? And it did. This is a victory for everyone, I would say.
That's pretty remarkable. When you look at the votes, it was an overwhelming vote in support of this, bipartisan vote. The governor and Kevin Orr and Jerry Rosen, the bankruptcy judge, did a marvelous job of lobbying the legislature and making their case.
So they weren't politicians this week. I think someone said that we were statesmen this week. Would you say that, Stephen?
Yeah. Okay. Let's not get too excited.
Oh, wait, you're not even going to give the legislature a pass for 1 week.
There's no Lincoln or Johnson in the process here, but there was quite a bit of magnanimity, I think, and the leadership, I think, in both houses, in fact, deserves a lot of credit. This wasn't an easy sell, and Jace Bolger, who's the House Speaker, and Randy Richardville, the Senate Majority Leader, really pushed hard to say this has got to be done, and seemed to have brought a lot of their colleagues to this new place where they're standing on the House floor, on the Senate floor, talking about, hey, look, I live in Jackson, or I live in West Branch, but I am, in colleague with Detroiters, and that what happens to them does matter to me and to my constituents. And I think that is very significant. I have not seen that before in that legislature.
It's never happened before.
I was just going to say, what do you think took it to get to that point, though?
It's a shift. There's been a real shift in attitudes about Detroit, not just around here, but statewide. I think there's a growing awareness, as Steve said, of the importance of Detroit to our overall state economy, but there's also a growing affection and enthusiasm for Detroit. People are rooting for the city, not just in Michigan, but all over the country.
Yeah. And
I think that's what you're seeing.
That's a really interesting shift, then.
I think it is. I mean, I think I don't remember seeing it before. Not to the extent that we saw it over the last couple of weeks. You could feel it on Mackinac last week. The number of outstate legislators who were genuinely, excited about the idea of being partners with Detroit. You just don't see it. You think of how well Mayor Duggan did, but also how well Brenda Jones, the city council president, seemed to play up on Mackinac last week. I can't remember that happening.
And I think it's a really interesting point, because so many times people say, what do you do up on Mackinac Island? And no matter how many times that we explain, and here at Detroit Public Television, we're able to carry the conference live so people can see it and see what's going on up there. I think there's where you see the value of what happens at Mackinac, and even some of the side conversations that actually help get this deal done, Nolan.
Yeah, there was a lot of that going on, both on this and some other issues, the water authority, transportation. There were a lot of conversations going on about the big issues, and of course none was bigger than this one. Once the House passed, though, before we went up to Mackinac, I think the Senate was pretty much a foregone conclusion, and what was worked on up there is easing over some of the concerns they had, smoothing out the legislation. This went remarkably smoothly this week.
What does this make us look like to the rest of the country, Stephen, this deal that we're able to come up with?
Well, it's unprecedented. I mean, again, the bankruptcy itself is unprecedented because of the size for a municipality, but this kind of deal inside a municipal bankruptcy is also completely unprecedented. I mean, you never see this kind of private capital, philanthropic capital being sort of showered on a city and its creditors to try to ease that process. Now, the big question mark is we don't really know whether this is going to hold through the legal process. I mean, is this okay under a Chapter 9? There are a lot of irregularities in terms of the bankruptcy code that are sort of baked into this deal, and the judge is going to have to defend those if he decides to approve the deal, and then it's going to have to stand up at the appellate level. Which
well, before that though, it's got to pass. The retirees have to accept it.
The retirees have to accept
and
it
that's
too. Sure.
That vote, those ballots are due in July 11th.
Yeah.
If they turn it down, if they vote no out of anger, frustration,
Yeah.
or somehow the belief that there's a better deal coming, this thing goes away. It scuttles, and I don't know where we are then.
Well,
and
yeah.
you still have the sort of irresponsible union leaders of AFSCME, Police and Fire, other unions not stepping up and saying, "Look, guys, you should take this because this is as good."
Although
as
you
it's
do
gonna
have
get."
you do have some union leaders saying
Some.
the opposite and saying, "Look, this is the best that we can do, and you got to vote for it." You also have the ballots now coming in. Kevin Orr says that the ones that have come in so far are 2-1 in favor. That's important. I think you don't need everybody to approve it. Obviously,
No.
You need 51% of the dollar amount. Actually, it's a strange calculation. It's not 51% of the retirees.
Yeah, and Kevin Orr said just last week, he said he's not taking anything for granted. I think he even still said it this week. He said, look, I mean, this is still part of the process that, in July, when they go into court, that we do celebrate what happened this week and what this agreement was, but no way are we done by a long shot.
Creditors got to buy in, and pensioners have to buy in. And if that doesn't happen, this thing could stretch on and on and on.
Yeah, I mean, if you get Judge Rhodes in a position where he's got to cram this down on enough creditors, you increase the likelihood of some sort of appeal that undoes it. And so I think, the bargaining that has been taking place in terms of, trying to get people to settle, big creditors to settle, will continue between now and when they have this trial in July to sort of finalize this whole thing. You want to get as many people as you can to say, I'm okay with this deal, and I think this is the best I can do.
I see something like this and I say, how long can the good feelings last of all of us, of really everyone working together on this front, Nolan?
Well, I mean, hopefully we're seeing a new dynamic at work. Again, this was one of the rare things we've seen come out of Lansing, with really true bipartisan support. Both the Democratic and the Republican leadership were on board, and most of their caucuses. And who knows, roads coming up, that's a tough issue. Maybe it'll extend to that and some other things.
All right, so another large question looming about this is we see this happening for Detroit. And the next question, and I asked the governor this last week, so there are so many other cities who are watching this and saying, we're in financial trouble. Could this possibly be a pathway for us that we could get some kind of help from the state? And he said, well, this is a very unique circumstance. So, Stephen, from your angle, I mean, does this line up other cities and municipalities saying, okay, can we get some money to help us out financially down the road?
Well, not in a bankruptcy. I mean, I think if you see anyone else go into bankruptcy, it would look really different from what we're seeing in Detroit. There's no grand bargain for Flint, right? You're not going to see the philanthropic support come through, and their assets won't be protected the way that people tried to protect things in Detroit. I think separate from that, though, is the question of whether we can finally start this conversation about how we finance municipal government and local services in this state, which is really broken. And there are a lot of very, very tricky questions that need to be sorted through there. Like, how do we want to do it? How much taxes do people here want to pay? How much government do we want to have at the local level? Those are all very fundamental questions that we seem to sort of be dancing around with things like the emergency manager law. But at some point, we're going to have to sit down and say, we have more government than we are willing to pay for right now, and that is unsustainable. So we got to figure out either to pay more or to have less.
All right, so there may not be a grand bargain that would ever happen to Flint, but would there ever be, again, any money from the state?
Well, we asked the governor that, and he said he expects others to ask, but the answer is no. He's said they're going to try to do a little better job of early warning, with the early warning to intervene in communities that are getting in trouble, not let it go so far that bankruptcy becomes the only option, as it was in Detroit. Remember, if the state would have stepped in 2-3 years ago with emergency manager, with some other help, straightening out the finances, bankruptcy might not have been necessary. It was really the last 2, 3, 4 years that debt started escalating beyond control.
Do you really think that bankruptcy wouldn't have been necessary?
I think had they got ahead of this borrowing, if the state had stepped in and stopped this borrowing for operations, which they did very heavily for 3 or 4 years,
for a while, yeah.
And that just pushed them over to the point where they couldn't meet their obligations.
Did he really have a choice, though?
Sure.
At that opportunity?
Well, the choice
restructure.
The choice at that point was to borrow or to file bankruptcy. Quite frankly, I mean, again, these are fundamental problems. This is it's not just mismanagement or waste. Those are very glib and simple answers to what's going on, and it's part of the problem, but it's not the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is that you've lost something like 35% of the taxable value of the city of Detroit, and you just can't generate the money you need to deliver services. You've got to.
But Steve, they had several chances over the years to get in front of this pension problem and didn't do it. They
didn't have the money.
They had several chances to restructure operations, to get a more rational and they just allowed.
Yeah, but when your back's not up against the wall, when you're finally facing this, it's almost easier to make a deal when you find
the
now we're finally
on the operations side.
That's why they waited until
but
the
the problems on the operations side are not what drove us into bankruptcy. It was the massive unfunded liabilities that were driven by declining tax base.
But we kept adding to that both on the operating side and the pension side.
Yeah,
and had the state stepped in 2 or 3 years earlier, they might have been able to fix this.
I think the swaps deal, which was
the killer,
which was about fixing
2005
pension.
about
2005 originally, and then renegotiated in 2009 to securitize the casino revenue to pay for it. Those two deals, which were all about pensions, right? That was to fill a $400 million shortfall in pensions. Once we did that, I think
that sealed the deal.
Were done.
Okay, so now we're going to have state oversight in the city of Detroit for the next 13 years. Is that enough to stabilize, to make sure that there are no other deals like that are made to ensure Detroit's financial viability?
I mean, that depends on a lot of things. Certainly for the short term, Detroit's going to have a much better balance sheet and going to have money to do a lot of things they haven't been able to do so well the last several years. Services, public safety, what have you. But it doesn't necessarily change the fact that the tax base is still shrinking. They have to very quickly stabilize this population and start growing the city again. This plan depends on city revenue growing, the city's economic base growing. If that doesn't happen, there's no way long term they can sustain a healthy balance sheet.
Is this oversight the best possible option?
It's necessary. You have to have some mechanism to say no when politicians won't. We've seen that over and over in Detroit, that leadership is unable to make the tough decisions to keep us out of financial trouble. Yeah. We've got good leadership right now, both at the mayor, in the mayor's office and at the council table. But 4 years from now, 8 years from now, who knows what that looks like? You could get somebody else who's irresponsible. So you need that oversight. You also are going to need growth, as Nolan was talking about. If you can't grow the city's tax base, you're not going to get out of this. And you need more investment. The state has really, really changed the way it funds local municipalities. You look at the revenue sharing model that we came up with 30 years ago to sustain local government. It's broken. It doesn't work anymore. So we gotta think of some other way to get all that stuff done.
Yeah, before we leave this topic, I want to talk really quickly about the contribution from the foundations that is coming in with the grand bargain. And you even saw that the Skillman Foundation stepped up with $4 million. Do we see somewhere down the road any kind of void of money in other programs because there are so much foundation money going towards this grand bargain. Will we see that hurt in other places?
Well, the foundations all say no. Well, you know, this, but it's bound. That's a lot of money. The pie isn't unlimited. The resources these foundations have are finite. So yes, unless some others step up, unless they grow the overall donor base in this community. I talked to several of the arts organizations over the past few days for my column today, and they're all worried about the impact of this. They all support the grand bargain, but they all also are in there reworking their own strategies to see how they can increase their donor base, because the same folks who are funding the grand bargain for the DIA, you know, they're the ones who fund everything else, and so there's less money to go around. But it's not just there. The Wayne County Commission this morning voted on money for the M1 rail, taking $3 million out of the road funds for the M1 rail. That's money that would have gone perhaps to smooth roads in western Wayne County. So is this sense, growing sense out there that Detroit's sucking away maybe a disproportionate amount of resources.
What do you think the impact will be, Stephen?
I mean, I don't think we know. I mean, these are foundations that I would say that are super committed to the city, and that's a good thing, right? These are not people just sort of swooping in and saying, well, I'll help out now, but they have got long-term investments in stuff that's going on. I think one of the things that's really interesting to me here is the involvement of the Ford Foundation in New York, who sort of took the lead in trying to get some of the other foundations to commit to this. Ford's not all that involved in Detroit. I mean, historically, there's been a distance there, and I think in that particular instance, this could be, you know, opening the door to a much more robust involvement with the city. In that case, we might come out ahead.
And that's the key. If we could, because the Ford Foundation hasn't been here. That's separate from the
It's not the Ford
family
foundation, right?
But they haven't been that involved here in many, many years. The family is no longer controls it. But if you can get foundations who haven't been involved here, and I think that's, you know, playing off this sympathy and growing enthusiasm for Detroit nationwide, that if you can get different players in here, you can ease out the impact of this $460 million.
And maybe get some more funding down the road.